I'd like to now invite Dr. Ben Saville to speak on how to design an adaptive platform trial. Dr. Saville is the president and lead statistical scientist of Adaptix trials, where he specializes in the design of innovative Bayesian and adaptive clinical trials. He works primarily with medical device and pharmaceutical companies to solve challenging problems via Bayesian designs. Dr. Saville has designed Bayesian clinical trials in a variety of therapeutic areas, including cardiovascular diseases, rare and progressive diseases, infectious diseases, stroke and traumatic brain injury, respiratory and digestive disorders, and neurological diseases. Welcome, Dr. Saville.
Thank you very much. It was a great introduction from John on what platform trials are. So I'll give you kind of what I plan on talking about. I'm going to glance over the basics of platform trial very quickly, since he did a good job summarizing that. But I want to talk more about, okay, how do we even start to think about a platform trial? What are the concepts? What are the things we need to actually put something like this on paper and put it in practice? And how do we use simulations to understand to design the trial? What's the role of statisticians in there? And how is it organized? This paper was talked about by John, but again, the basic idea is the traditional trial is you have a single homogeneous group of patients, you have a single question, and you want to know, does drug work in this type of patients? In platform trials, the focus is on the disease. So instead of asking, does this drug work, we're saying, what's the best way to treat patients with this disease? What's the best combination of treatments? And for that, you might end up with this grid where you have lots of different types of patients and lots of different interventions. And the traditional trial says, well, let's have a trial within each one of these cells. And we're saying, well, why don't we have a platform trial that encompasses this whole spectrum? And we can use appropriate methodologies to understand how the outcomes vary across these different cells. There are often innovations in terms of adaptations, and John touched on these. And the idea here is that you don't know a lot of things when you start the trial. And you want to make use of the data as you go through the trial to understand more about the parameters that are really important for, say, sample size, variability in the endpoint, et cetera. And so there's a lot of adaptations that one could pre-specify in a clinical trial, in a platform trial, that could then be part of the algorithm. There's a question about the regulatory, how do they feel about platform trials? There's actually a guidance on this, this FDA guidance, a draft guidance. In fact, I don't know if I have the paper here, I might, but the FDA is definitely proponents of platform trials. And of course, it depends on what division you're talking to and what disease you're in and how they view this. But the FDA, certainly, at least the leaders, recognize that platform trials are a really efficient way to help address the problems and the questions that we have in science. Here's a paper I wrote with Scott Berry about efficiencies. There's a lot of statistical efficiencies we get from platform trials. And that's just not, even operationally, and yes, there's time, but there's actually, in terms of being able to answer questions with fewer patients and fewer patients on placebo, et cetera. This is a kind of a schematic to show what is a potential strategy one could use in designing a platform trial. So you might start with, say, 3 interventions, A, B, and C, and you might be comparing them to a common control. And as the intervention goes along, you would have pre-specified adaptations that could be triggered based on the observed data. So for example, you might say, well, actually, we have new interventions that we've learned about that we'd love to introduce into this trial. Now, the traditional way of dealing with this is, okay, let's start a whole new trial, okay? And this is saying, hey, we already have an infrastructure here, we already have the sites. This is so much easier in terms of, and so much more efficient to just embed these new interventions within the existing platform trial we have. We might have a pre-existing algorithm that says that if you have certain evidence of harm or futility, you kick an intervention out of the trial. You might have a pre-specified rule that says, well, if there's benefit of, say, D and A, maybe we combine those and create a new intervention, A plus D. Okay, of course, this would be very dependent on what the context was of the disease and what these drugs actually were. And we might find that maybe B is superior. Maybe this is actually better than control. And if that does happen, what do we do with our control? Well, maybe B is now our new control moving forward. And so now we're thinking about B as being the new gold standard we're comparing interventions to. So this is just one slice of what a platform trial could look like. This certainly is not necessarily what remap cap looks like, but this is one flavor, and I'll talk more about just general flavors in a minute. Platform trials are certainly happening. They've been around for a while now. Here's a list of different ones going on in oncology, neurology, respiratory diseases, and stroke, as well as infectious diseases and COVID-19. I need to add can treat COVID into this for the investigators here. This is an older slide, but certainly a lot is going on in COVID. And in fact, I think COVID was actually a great way for the scientific community to recognize the importance and the benefits of platform trials. And in fact, we saw hundreds of trials, for example, in hydroxychloroquine. So many small trials that didn't amount to anything, no conclusions, because they just couldn't enroll, they couldn't recruit. But if you looked at the big platform trials, the REMAC CAP, you looked at Principle, you look at Recovery, looked at Solidarity, all these trials that were platform trials, these all had major findings in terms of beneficial treatments. And I think this is really just an illustration of how important these platform trials are for addressing the global need of, hey, what's the best way to treat this disease? Okay, so that being said, how do we start? You know, we have an idea of a platform trial. How does this even start? Well, you start with the disease, first and foremost. You have to have a disease where there are many interventions and many different kinds of treatments that you're interested in studying, not just one. You think, well, what's the best? There's uncertainty about what the best way is to treat this disease. And we would like to have a rigorous trial to help us understand what is the best way to do this. And so you bring together a team. You have clinical experts, you have clinical trialists, you have statisticians, and you brainstorm. You have to think about the primary objectives and questions. Well, is this going to be a comparative effectiveness study? Maybe there's no control. We just want to know what's the best way to treat patients among existing treatments. Maybe it's for novel therapies. So it could be something, for example, in ALS, where just nothing works. And we want to screen for new interventions that could potentially get regulatory approval. It could be that maybe it's a combination of screening as well as getting regulatory approval. So these seamless phase 2, 3 designs. And so you have to think about what is, this is really highly dependent on the context of the disease. The first, and after that, I think the next big step is thinking about what is the general structure. And I kind of think of there as being two distinct general structures that I would start talking to investigators about. The first is this schematic that I just showed you, where you have different interventions versus a common control. And if you took out that control, then it would just be comparative effectiveness amongst those interventions, right? But that is, you have adaptations. You could potentially have subgroups within that. But just thinking, just first and foremost, just about, what are we comparing here? What are our primary questions? And then schematic B is saying, well, actually, I have different domains, and John touched on this more in depth, where he talked about remap cap and these different domains. What is a domain? It's really a set of interventions that you'd randomize to. So it could be a certain class of drugs, it could be a certain type of therapy, and and you have randomization with each one of these domains. And so what happens in schematic B is that each patient gets multiple randomizations, whereas A patient only gets one randomization. So in B, I come into the study, if I'm a patient, I may get randomized in domain A, B, and C, and I have a different intervention in each one of those domains. And so different structure, different questions, and different paradigms. We have to think about patient populations, eligibility criteria. So the traditional trial says, well, we want to be as inclusive as possible, where we expect to see benefit. It's a bit more complicated that in a platform trial, because not all interventions are going to target the same populations. If this is, for example, if you're doing something for regulatory approval, where you're looking at a phase 2/3 trial, different industry partners come in and they want to target slightly different populations or maybe very different populations. Well, how do you do that? Well, you probably want to be as inclusive as possible and recognize that there are eligibility criteria for the platform, and there may be regimen-specific eligibility criteria for each of the interventions that come in. It's detrimental to the platform, though, if they are too narrow. It's better if the interventions come in and they are just as broad as the whole platform. And so there's a trade-off there, and discussions that have to happen about what the patient population would be. And then analytically, how are we going to handle differences in populations? So that's for the statisticians to help communicate and sort it out in terms of that there's different ways to approach that. There also could be biomarkers and subgroups. That's a kind of a key trademark of platform trials is we want to know, how does this, it's not just one type of patient. It's like that first grid I showed you. There's actually lots of different types of patients. So maybe patient A, here's the best treatment for them, but patient B, they need a different kind of treatment, different combination of treatments. So I wanted to kind of, I've had some discussions recently with the Heart Failure Collaboratory in the United States, which is a consortium of stakeholders in heart failure. And it's a public-private partnership with FDA, industry, and academics. And they've been pitching this idea of a platform trial in heart failure. And I've been talking to them about that. And so I wanted to kind of just throw out just kind of this platform trial is not baked at all, actually. But I just wanted to kind of throw out this idea as a way to show how we even start thinking about this. And so the way we've done it with this trial is we started with some very large meetings where we just introduced the concept. We get feedback, we get ideas, we talk about objectives, how we might fund this, what kind of industry partners might be interested in this. And then we break off and we have smaller focused meetings with a smaller group where we talk about what I'm going to call skeleton designs. What is a skeleton design? Well, it's a schematic that kind of shows here's the grid, or here's what we want to look at in this trial. So the statistician is really key to this part in the sense that they need to elicit questions and kind of help build what the skeleton design could look like, because not everyone has the same picture of what a platform trial is. And so oftentimes it's up to the statistician to really understand, okay, here's the clinical questions, here's all these different things I'm hearing. Let me put that together in something concrete that they can look at and say, oh yeah, that's what I want, or no, that's not what I'm thinking. And so here's some skeleton designs I put together for a platform trial in heart failure. And I pitched 3 different ideas. I said, okay, here's the first one. Because they kept talking about all these different interventions they were interested in, different combinations. So SGLT inhibitors, MRA drugs, ARNI drugs, and GLP drugs, beta blockers. There are these different classes of drugs. And so they were interested, and they kind of spatted out these 7 different interventions they were interested in combinations. And they said, well, we think these might differ by gender, by age, and we think this would be a great platform trial. And so I wrote down this grid to kind of show what this platform trial could look like. I said, okay, here's option 1. Option 2 would be, well, really, it's kind of, you can think of this as being different domains where we have multiple randomizations. The last slide, every patient only got 1 randomization to one of those 7. This one is kind of taking that second paradigm where you give multiple randomizations. So a patient comes in, they get randomized to ARNI, yes or no. They get randomized to beta blockers, yes or no, and GLP. So there's multiple interventions going on. There may be some contraindications where you can't have certain combinations, of course. But the idea here is you can get multiple randomizations of the same patient, and we want to know what's the best combination of drugs. So there's a lot of fine small print down here, but basically the question here is, what is the best combination of drugs, perhaps by subgroup? And then I extended that and said, well, we can even take this beyond drugs and say, okay, well, we have different domains for each class of drug, but we also could have non-pharmaceutical domains such as sodium restriction or exercise, cardiac rehab. So we could have, think about what are other ways we can use to treat heart failure, and what are the questions of interest. And they really like this. They really so we're talking more about this still, and this is still on the table. But really, here is what's the best combination of drugs, and then maybe even thinking about different subgroups, because different types of patients, different types of heart failure patients, maybe based on NT-proBNP, on their ejection fraction. There's different severity, NYHA class. There's various things that might lead some patients to have differential benefit to different outcomes. And then the natural question, actually, this question came up almost even immediately, is okay, how are we gonna fund this? Who's gonna pay for this, and how do you afford a platform trial? Well, you kind of have to think about the skeleton design first, okay? And once you have the skeleton designs, okay, you notice I haven't even talked about endpoints. I was just talking about the schematics in terms of what are the treatments we're interested in, and what are the groups we're interested in looking at. What's the patient population? But now we have to talk about endpoints. There's different endpoints. It could be heart failure hospitalizations, mortality. It could be quality of life, the KCCQ. There's various things you can look at for the primary endpoints, and all those have very different implications with respect to sample size and power and cost. And who would be interested in funding this? We have patient organizations. Are there government grants? Are there private companies? How much is it going to cost? Well, so this is kind of the point we're at right now. And basically what I've promised is to say, okay, well, let's talk about the endpoints. So let's talk about the primary questions. And let's just focus on these primary endpoints. Let's not have any adaptations. Let's just talk about, if we did some basic power calculations, what would be the expected sample size that we would need for a trial like this to answer the key questions. And use that to make a go, no-go decision about whether we're going to proceed forward with the planning of platform trial. Because now we have to talk about, okay, how do you design a platform trial? Well, we need funding for the trial design. It's not something you just plug in your calculator and you get your sample size. This is just kind of an approximation of here's kind of the ballpark we're in. And okay, next question is this fundable? And then if so, then okay, let's design this trial. How are we going to design it? Well, now we're going to use virtual trial simulations. And what I mean by this is that we're going to use essentially virtual data where we simulate patient outcomes. We use that to simulate trials, and we use that to power the trial. We use that to plug in our algorithm that addresses all the questions we're interested in answering. And this is a process that goes on for potentially months. And it's not as simple, hey, come back tomorrow with calculation. It's a lot of effort, and it requires funding. And so we need, at least at a bare minimum, we need some funding for the planning of the trial, even if we don't have the funding yet to run the trial. When people hear the word simulations, we often think about, well, you're trying to predict what's going to happen in this trial. We're talking about using simulations to predict things. And that's not what I mean here. When I talk about simulations, I'm not talking about trying to project the track of Hurricane Helene. I'm not trying to predict who's going to win the football season. I'm going to use virtual trial simulations to understand the algorithm of the platform trial. And in this way, it's a lot like building an airplane. You build this in silico, right? So you might build an airplane and you have the computer model for it, and you might test, the drag, the lift, the speed, all these different metrics of this airplane you might be testing. And then you might play with things. Okay, what if we make the design more narrow? What if we change the wing shape? We're going to change different things, and now we're going to put that through this computer simulation and see how this affects the outcomes of this trial. I'm sorry, of this plane. And we do this to build a better airplane. It's part of the design process. And building a platform trial using virtual trial simulations is exactly the same thing. We're going to have this algorithm, this pre-specified algorithm. This is not something where we're just looking at the data and making up things as we go. This is a very well planned out study where we have an algorithm. And we want to know how well this algorithm does in a variety of different settings. Just the same way we want to know how our plane flies in a variety of different settings. If you're flying in rainy, windy weather versus a nice clear day, you want to know how your plane is going to go. Same way you want to know how your platform trial is going to run. And how do you do this? Well, you start with simulating individual patient outcomes. This is where historical data is very, very valuable. And disease areas where you have natural history data, where you have a resource. For example, in ALS, we have the PROACT database, which is essentially all the control data from all sorts of clinical trials over the last several decades. Hugely helpful in understanding the variability of the endpoints that we're interested in for this disease. And so you leverage whatever historical data you have, whatever publication data you have, to understand the variability of the endpoints you're interested in. And you start by simulating those patient outcomes. And then you simulate a full trial. And when I say a fixed trial, I mean it's not like an adaptive sample size. It's just maybe it's a fixed trial of 500 patients in each group, okay? And what you're going to do then is you're going to initially you're going to compare your endpoints, your primary analyses. There's different ways of analyzing data. There's different endpoints that have different implications with respect to power. If your endpoint is mortality, well, I mean, depending on the prevalence of deaths, that could be a much larger sample size than an endpoint such as a quality of life measure, such as KCCQ, for example, in heart failure. And so the endpoints matter a lot. And so you're going to spend a lot of time talking about endpoints with your group. You're going to spend a lot of time talking about different ways of analyzing those endpoints. And once you've talked through those, you're going to start thinking about, well, clinicians are going to ask questions about, well, what about this? What about that? Is there a way we can give more patients to this group over here, or we want to answer this question over there? And these clinicians' questions are going to drive what I'm going to call adaptation. So this is what John was talking about earlier about there being pre-specified adaptations. Those are driven by the science. They're driven by the questions from the clinicians. And then we'd introduce those same adaptations in these virtual trial simulations. And now we have an adaptive trial that's essentially it's a simulated adaptive trial. And we can perform the primary analysis on this algorithm, on this adaptive trial. And then we can repeat that process thousands of times. And we can really understand, just like an airplane, what's our probability of different outcomes based on the conditions or the assumptions that we might encounter in real life. So we don't expect to get the perfect platform trial on the first attempt. Just like we don't expect to get the perfect airplane on the first attempt. We need iterations. It's part of the process. It's a natural part of the design process to go through these iterations. So the statistician would simulate these virtual trials. We show the output to the clinicians, to the team. We get feedback. We have reactions. We have revisions. They say, well, I like this. I don't like that. What if we did this instead? And basically, you're just like the plane. You're saying, well, what if we change this about the nose? We change this about the wing. You stay doing the same thing with the clinical trial. And you revise and you repeat, you revise or you run the simulations, you show new updates, and this is a process. And we do this through there's really kind of two ways we show these simulation results. One is what I'm going to call operating characteristics, where we simulate thousands of trials and we summarize performance metrics over those thousands of trials. Could be the power, type 1 error, average sample size, probability of dropping an arm, what's the probability of the probability of getting randomized to each one of these arms if you use in response to adaptive randomization. And then you're going to you'll compare perhaps competing designs. Maybe you have frequent analyses every 3 months versus every 6 months versus what if we do X, Y, and Z instead. So basically you're going to use these summaries over these thousands of trials to compare various attributes or various characteristics of your design. And then the other thing you're going to use is I'm going to call example trials. And these are really just hypothetical trials. Again, I'm not trying to predict what's going to happen with this platform trial, but I'm just saying, what if our data were these? What would our algorithms say? What would our algorithm do? It's a chance to see your trial in action before you actually even run your trial. If you're surprised, if you design a platform trial, you run it, and then you look at the results and you're surprised with what your algorithm did, you didn't do your homework. Okay, you should be going through lots and lots of these example trials. You should really understand what your algorithm is going to do frontwards and backwards for different kinds of data sets, for different kinds of conditions. Just like an airplane, you're going to encounter different flying conditions. In real life, we're going to encounter all sorts of different kind of situations and different kinds of data, things we didn't expect. And so we need to understand what would this algorithm do. And those, this is a chance to see your trial in action before you actually run it. And I'll show you what I mean by that. And we're going to iterate on both of these. And the design's not going to be done. It's not going to be baked until we're happy with both of these. This is an example. It's a little cut off, but this is just an example trial in cystic fibrosis. And I'm not going to go through all the details here, but I just want to show you what a movie looks like. So this is a simulated data set, made up data. It could be the data they actually get in the trial. It may not be. But the point is if these were the data, what would the model say? What would the algorithm do? What would be the proportion of patients allocated to each one of these interventions? In this particular study, it's 2 domains, A and B, and there's different interventions in each domain. And so we're trying to figure out what's the best combination of A and B. And as we go through this trial, this is n equals 1,000 patients, and there's different things going on here. We're seeing the number of patients in each one of these interventions. We're seeing the randomization probabilities being updated. We're seeing decisions. We go through this whole trial. We get at the end of the day, and here's what your results look like at the end of the day. And we're able to show the primary analysis results that say, okay, here's the intervention that is better than the others. Is this a success? Did you learn what you wanted to learn? Are there questions you have about these data that weren't answered? If so, then we need to kind of go back to the drawing board. But if we say, yeah, if these were the results of the trial, I'd be disappointed by this, disappointed by that. But no, I think this really answers the questions that I have if these were the results. Still not quite shown up there, but and these are just, there should be a graph there that has lots of data points on it that just shows the probability of stopping. So this would be like a table of the operating characteristics. So the last set of slides was a picture of an example trial. This is what happens over thousands of trials. We have a summary, we have tables, we have power, we have type 1 error, et cetera. So adaptations, John talked about this as well. Well, we could spend, days talking about adaptations. It's a really complex topic, and I'm not really going to dive too much into it, but he made a really good point that it's based on a pre-specified adaptation. It's not something where we just make it up as we go. You have pre-specified adaptations, and it really depends on the objectives of the trial, the endpoints you're interested in, and the analyses that you're using. Could be arm dropping, could be early success, could be graduating to phase 3, could be response adaptive randomization, population enrichment, all sorts of things. But the main key to remember is that these are driven by the clinical questions, and they're very customized to each specific platform trial. I've designed several platform trials, many of which when I was at Bayer Consultants, and they're all different. They're all very unique, and they're all very different. I don't think I've never done a copy paste to the next platform trial. They are all customized, and you need a team that's able to put that together. And that's my next slide here is really platform trial requires a team. It's not a solo effort. You need a clinical and statistical leaders. And you need experts in diverse areas working towards a common goal. Communication is really essential because you have experts that are really good in their different fields, and you have to bring these experts, and they have to be able to communicate their really fine-tuned knowledge in their field to the other experts and the other disciplines. And so I know there are statisticians in the audience, so I wanted to just talk for a minute about statisticians, because statisticians are really key to designing these platform trials. The traditional role of a statistician is that a clinician will often come up with a research question, they develop their protocol synopsis, they then reach out to the statistician and say, hey, can you do the sample size calculation for me? I can only afford 180 patients, by the way. And can you give me a paragraph here that gives me a power calculation? And the statistician says, okay, sure. And they give that short paragraph. And then later the clinician comes back and says, okay, I'm ready for the full statistical analysis plan. I got my funding or whatever. And that's kind of the way it works. And it's the clinicians and the statisticians working in silos. And there's not collaboration. There's not the synergy there. And the statisticians are regarded as calculators. And you can't use that mold, that approach in an adaptive platform trial. So statisticians, we're going to pick on us for a minute. We tend to be introverts. We like to work by ourselves. We tend to be kind of critical thinkers and kind of pessimistic. We tend to be very precise. We worry about all the little small details. Maybe we get stuck in the weeds sometimes. We often are not very good speakers. We speak statistics, and most people find statistics as being very boring. Okay? So what do we need to do? Well, we need to speak the language of our collaborators. Okay, we need to, whether our collaborators, it's a clinician, a CEO, a clinical trialist, an investor, we have to be able to speak their language. We can't expect them to speak statistics. And we should ask ourselves these questions. Are we leaders? Are we integrating ourselves in the team? Are we providing insight? Are we integral to the key decisions? Are they making decisions on their own and then coming to me and telling me what they decided? Or am I at the table? Am I a part of those decisions? Statisticians should absolutely be part of that process. They should not be working in isolation. They should be part of the team. And clinical teams, so my point is you can't design a team with just a statistician. You can't design a platform trial with just a statistician. You also can't design a platform trial with just a clinical team. You need both, and they need to be talking to each other. And we need statistical leaders in platform trial design. And because really, statisticians, they're not just number crunchers, they are scientists. They're experts in the science of clinical trials. And that's also, I have a bunch of things listed here in terms of what the statisticians understand. And there needs to be synergy, there needs to be communication and understanding of, okay, you have experts in the statistical theory and the science of clinical trials, and you have experts in the disease, you have other experts in the operations, and you have to bring all these personalities together to really make an effective platform trial. I'm going to glance briefly over trial operations. That you also need to think about planning the structure of a platform trial up front. You can just kick it off, and we did it in COVID-19. And for example, the principal trial where we were enrolling within 2 or 3 weeks of the initial concept, and then we kind of just put everything together as we went. But ideally, we think of these things ahead of time instead of on the fly while we're running. And you have to think about all the different groups that are involved in a platform trial. You have design, you have operations, you have all sorts of committees. There's trial maintenance. There's always going to be work in a platform trial. I'm blown away with just how much time and effort a trial takes even after you've designed it. So I've designed a lot of Bayesian adaptive platform trials, and most of them the design is done, it's baked, I hand to the sponsor, and they go off and they run it. A platform trial, I'm still having weekly calls with these companies, and we can barely squeeze in that hour weekly call of all the things we need to talk about. There's so much to talk about. There's constant maintenance, and there's going to be fewer problems and less maintenance if we think about all these issues in advance. This is the intervention timeline of the principal trial, and I'm just making the point that there were a lot of issues that came up when we ran this trial, and a lot of it was because we had to do it on the fly. And going back, if we could actually have the time necessary to set it up in advance, we could even do it better. But you need to have different committees. You have a design committee, you have clinicians, statisticians, operations, you'll have regimen-specific design meetings, you'll have operations teams, you'll have other groups, you got the DSMB, you got the regimen-specific steering committees. If it's an international trial like REMAP CAP, you have these international committees, you have different domain experts, and the structure goes on and on in terms of what you need to actually implement the trial. You need a lot of different statistical groups. You need statisticians who are experts in the disease. You need statisticians who are expert in the design of platform trials. And you need statisticians who actually can help implement it and do data management. So there's a lot to think about. Clear documentation. You have to think about, John talked about this, at least for REMAP CAP, where you have these domain-specific appendices. And here, this one actually, if you're thinking about maybe just the first kind of paradigm where you don't necessarily have the different domains, we have a master protocol, we have a master statistical analysis plan, we have what we're going to call a statistical analysis and design report, where you have all the simulations in that. You have a simulation appendix for each regimen that comes in. You have a table for conflict resolution, because all these, what happens if you update one but you forget to update the other? So you need to have some sort of a hierarchy. So version control, essential, communication, organization, all very, very important. Thinking about key issues like data sharing, thinking about how you're going to add new regimens, thinking about how you're going to address changes in the standard of care as the trial is ongoing, because it will happen. For example, in the Healy ALS platform trial, we had 2 new approvals for drugs that didn't exist when we designed the platform trial. What are you going to do? Well, you can't deny patients care to something that just got approved. You're going to have to incorporate that. You're going to have to address it. You have to think about funding a platform trial. I have a couple slides here, and these are color-coded based on different funding organizations. This is not a real formal slide in the sense that is my best attempt at trying to figure out who's funding these different trials. So the blue being more industry partners and the red being more government grants. And what I saw is just the whole mix. So a lot of variety in terms of the funding. And all the things you have to think about when you design a platform trial. So hopefully that's a good summary in terms of how you get started on a trial design, how virtual trial simulations are important, and how you might go about thinking about the organization. And the key really here is, again, is to focus on the disease and the optimal treatment for patients. And as long as we keep that in focus, then I think a lot of these things come into place. Thank you.
Thank you again, Dr. Saville. Once again, if anyone has any questions, please do raise your hand. We'll take one or two questions before we move on.
Thanks for a great presentation, and I always enjoy hearing statisticians speak. And they've always been a key part of my research team. So I love statistics and statisticians. So two questions. One is, it's more speculative. So you talked about, statistical simulations and calculations. Is there any potential future role of artificial intelligence or machine learning in this landscape? Because I know that's a real going concern. And the second question I have is about the use of historical data in the simulations and how you adjust for potentially biases in the historical sample itself. I think Andrew and others have shown that many clinical trials, so those would be the control groups that you're drawing from, are often not drawn from representative populations. So how do you factor that into your simulations? And thanks for a great presentation.
Great, thanks. Both great questions. I think there's absolutely a role for AI. I don't know what that role is, but it's probably going to find a way to make its way in there. I'm excited to see what AI can do in the design of platform trials. I've been amazed with just what AI can do in terms of coding and simulations. So some people can actually code simulations now through AI, which I don't know how to do, but I'm excited to figure out how that works. Then your second question about how do you address the populations potentially being different? So if you have historical data, there is no real, it's a challenge. I wouldn't say there's a real solid way of addressing that. If you're honest with yourself about the uncertainty in those populations, the historical data, I think that helps. So not cherry picking your trials that you want to look at, but actually thinking about the whole, all the available data that you might have access to, and always building in margins of estimates that are either higher or lower than what you might expect. For example, say you have historical data on the slope of function in ALS, okay, from the PROACT database. And so you might have assumptions that go into your model about, okay, here's the slope we're expecting. This is the natural disease progression. Well, what happens if our data have slower progression or faster progression? So we're going to simulate we're going to stress test our simulation by doing extremes, something higher or something lower than what we expect. And so I always try to simulate over a range of possibilities, not just what we expect.
Thank you for explaining the complexity. Has anyone shown the cost effectiveness of doing platform versus single trials? Because you showed so many complexities. I would rather do 5 single trials.
Yeah, so actually the first trial I showed you, one of those first publications I showed you, it talked about statistical efficiencies. There have been other papers and other discussions about what is the cost savings. So that was more statistical in terms of here's the number of patients that you save and here's the time you save. But I think there have been other papers about here's the actual cost in terms of money you can save. Of course, it's highly dependent on the disease, right? But yeah, there's tremendous savings potentially in platform trials. Not always. It really depends on how you design it. You could build a very burdensome platform trial that is not very efficient. It really depends on what is the scope, what does the landscape look like now in the the paradigm of 2 treatments at a time versus let's compare some innovative adaptive platform trial and see how much better it does.
Thanks so much for a fantastic talk, and I really appreciated your point about integrating statisticians with clinicians, and something we'll be taking back to the Canadian Primary Care Trials Network as well. Question is about training of statisticians and in this type of methodology. In Canada, at least, we've found it's actually quite difficult to find folks who have this expertise. Do you see this kind of starting to be integrated into the curriculum at the graduate level for statisticians coming out, or is this still really new and something that's not part of what people get trained in?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I have not seen it really adopted into the curriculum, and I've heard of people's struggles in terms of finding statisticians who are experienced to do this. And the best way to learn how to do it is like an apprenticeship to actually do it. And so the statisticians, there aren't that many in the world who know how to do this. I was prior to being with Adaptix Trials, I was with Berry Consultants, and they're like probably the world leaders in terms of statisticians doing these designs, and there's only 15 of them. And outside of that, the quality drops off and the experience drops off in terms of how to design an adaptive platform trial. I think the more we have, there's a big long list of the list I showed you of all the platform trials and other organizations doing it. And clearly that group of statisticians can't do all the platform trials in the world. So the more the platform trials that we see, the more people get hands-on experience. That's how you're going to get the experience, I think.
Okay, perfect. We'll move on